Hello, my people, and welcome back. So this is going to be for Module 2 for the Introduction to Psychology, and let's get started. So learning targets, I know there's a lot on the screen, but we are going to be going over philosophical, physiological perspectives. We're going to be talking about the very beginning, and then we are going to be discussing the new lenses that you can look at psychological situations through. And I always like to think of them as kind of like, you can think of them as like a political lens, like there's going to be behaviorists, there's going to be cognitive science psychologists, and they all have different ways of viewing a situation, which we will talk about. All right, so first, I stole this from one of my older presentations, and it's what is psychology, right? And today's current definition, it has changed a lot in the past, is the scientific study of behavior and mental processes, right? You have behavior and your mental capacity. So it's mind and body, how they connect, and then how do we see and how do we understand why people do what they do, right? So the scientific end is answering questions objectively based on facts. So behavioralists, which we'll talk about, love to see actions, which is where the behavior portion of psychology comes from observable actions. But then there's the mental aspect of psychology, which is your thoughts, feelings, sensations, perceptions, motivations, dreams, and how your experiences shape you, right? And there's a reason that we're all different, and it's because we are molded from nature and nurture, which is genetics and environment, to create who we are and how that influences our actions, right? So again, the scientific study of behavioral and mental processes. Very important. Know what psychology definition is. All right, so perspectives. And I want you to really focus in on this chart. You can fill in buzzwords as we go, but for now, leave them open and then you can complete them at the end, okay? So let's get started with these perspectives. This is the big core part of this beginning of our understanding psychology. So perspectives, think of them as different lenses to put on. So there's different lenses, and think of, I'm putting my biological lens on, and what that means is this. So perspectives that psychologists look at examples through are, the first one is biological. So the biological perspective is understanding how the brain and the body create thoughts, emotions, and memories, and they want to know what is going on inside the brain chemically, right? So a buzzword, just saying, could be chemical imbalance, right? So Sally, so again, here's Sally, our example person. If she is showing signs of depression, a biological point of view would say, I wonder how her brain chemistry is. That's how I would look at it, because through biological view, we're looking at inside the brain. Next up on our lenses, we have evolutionary lens. So I'm putting on a new lens. And psychologists who look through the evolutionary lens look at how natural selection causes behavior and how we adapt, right? So right now, evolutionary, there's a reason. So for example, why do we sleep at night? An evolutionary lens would say, well, back in the primal ages, our predators came out at nighttime. So there is an evolutionary way to explain why we sleep at night. So we're trying to protect ourselves and not be out during the nighttime when we could possibly get hurt. That would hurt our survival, right? So evolutionary, think of like it's very survival. How do we adapt, right? Survival of the fittest. There's a reason that we have thumbs. Yes, this allows us to do lots of things. So the evolutionary perspective is how we have, how does it connect to our survival, right? So then now we're going to put on our behavior lens, okay? And they call it behavior genetics, but you can still just put behavioral lens, okay? And behavioralists love to look at actions. They are all about how our genes are, they want to know, they're looking at our environment only. So a behavioral lens would say, so again, Sally is showing signs of depression. Sally is not hanging out with her friends. She's not hanging out with her family. So behavioralists will write down actions, and they love to look at physical things that allow them to collect data. So again, the behavioralists are all about data and what they can see, okay? And then we're going to turn into our psychoanalytical lens. And I like to call this the Freud lens. So we will get to know Freud in just a few slides, but this is the emphasis on the unconscious mind and our drives within our unconscious. So what Freud would say, so whenever we hear psychoanalytical, I want you guys to put Freud's name next to it. Okay, Freud is probably one of the more popular psychologists, not maybe for what he's discovered, but just from some of his crazy theories. But he did get a few things right, which is he's the one who didn't create, but he found the unconscious, that it is a thing within our minds, right? And so how the psychoanalytical view would view Sally with anxiety and depression would be what happened. So like what would start is like what happened in your childhood. So this is where you're going to sit on a couch and just start rambling about maybe dreams or it's called free association, which we'll learn, but it's essentially just kind of talking. And then what the psychoanalytical psychologists want to do is pull your unconscious desires or drives from your unconscious. So maybe Sally is anxious because her mother makes her fearful of maybe saying things out of line, or so she has been taught in her mind that to fear maybe her mother or something from a childhood event. So a buzzword for psychoanalytical would be childhood. Okay, so this is where they look at, what could our unconscious create from past experiences, okay? I know it's a lot of information. Hang in there. So this is the other end. So imagine this all on one slide, right? And so we talked about our behavioral, right? So the difference of behavioral genetic and then behavioral regular. So let's go back to our. This is where we look at how. So if we have a gene abnormality that will affect our behavior. So say if you maybe fall on the spectrum or you have a genetic abnormality, this is where this lens will look. But for the most part, what we want to look at is the behavioral lens. So like I said, it is shaped by the learning process, and it's all about what they can see. Okay, so behavioralists, again, having that little cap on, they're going to see Sally with her anxiety saying, okay, what actions is she showing? What actions are we seeing in her environment, and how can we conclude from those? Now we're going to put on our cognitive lens next. Okay, putting on our cognitive hat. And this is the lens that is all about the mind. Okay, so this is, if you're a cognitive psychologist, you look at Sally's anxiety and you think about is there a reason that A and B and C are not connected? So you're thinking of the thought process. So a really good example of this is, so say Sally has an eating disorder, right? And this is one of the easiest examples to talk about. So Sally has a cognitive abnormality because her thought process is abnormal. So Sally has an eating disorder, and say that if she sees a hamburger, she automatically gets anxious. She thinks she's going to get fat and she can't eat it, right? And it's how her thought process got to that conclusion, right? So if you've ever heard of cognitive therapy, a lot of it is just recorrecting how A gets to B gets to C, right? So the cognitive psychologist will be like, okay, Sally, let's think about baby steps. So what about a hamburger would make you feel this way? And it's all about recorrecting those abnormal thought processes, right? Through usually it's through therapy, through talking, right? So cognitive therapy is one of the more popular ones, or the most more widely used. So now we're going to get to the two newer ones that have been created in the last couple of decades. Okay, so we have humanistic. I'm a huge humanistic person. So when you're thinking about all these lenses, psychologists usually tend to pick one or pick a few. So there's a lot of, cognitive psychologists that look at how the brain, and that's how they observe through their lenses. Humanistic, putting that on, it's the emphasis on human growth and our potential to change and our self-worth. So if you've ever heard of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, he's a part of the humanistic perspective. He thinks that all humans are, so in this perspective, all humans are innately good until there is some reason, there's some environment changes that may cause lower self-esteem. So essentially, humanistic perspective is all focused on your growth within your environment. So if Sally has anxiety and you're looking at her through a humanistic perspective, we might notice that maybe her social groups have changed. Maybe there has been some comments on social media or something that's causing her self-worth to lower, or, cause her to have all these negative reactions. But the humanistic is looking at where is our self-confidence, our self-esteem at, and then do we have all of our levels of need with Maslow's hierarchy of needs to survive? Do we have food? Do we have water? How do we expect students to want to learn if they don't have a place with electricity right now, right? So it's very along those lines. And last but not least, last lens you can put on through a psychology perspective is social cultural. And this one is huge. It's exactly how it sounds. The social cultural lens looks at the person's social life and their cultural life. And what that means is, how is your behaviors change due to your social circles and your cultural circles? So say that Sally, let's do Bob. So say that Bob is having depression, and he comes from a culture that doesn't believe in mental health. And so his behaviors are bottled in due to his cultural influences, right? It's not okay for men to feel this way in certain cultures, or, the social. So this is a lot of looking at your peers and what's happening culturally to the situation. Okay. So again, it is a way, social cultural. Those type of psychologists look at your social influences and then how your culture could influence your actions. Okay. All right. Hope you're hanging in there. Next up. Okay. So just a little background on the history of psychology. Where did this relation to the mind and the body come from? So back long ago, people were already starting to think how the mind and body are connected or they are apart. So, Aristotle was one for saying that the mind and the body are connected. But on the other end, Socrates and I think this was to say Plato. Sorry, that says Pluto. And Descartes, they were really saying no, the mind and the body are separate. So this has been a conversation for a long time, but psychology didn't really form until around the around the 1900s, right? Because it's so hard to really, how do you think of the mind, since the mind you cannot see, right? Oh, how psychological does that sound? Pre-scientific psychology. So again, there was some ideas so Socrates and Plato thought that so the way that we learn is innate. So we already have all the knowledge in our brains when we are born, right? So that was one theory. But on the other end, Aristotle and John Locke said, when you're born, you have a blank slate. You learn everything, right? And this is where nature and nurture come in. And we're gonna hear this perspective a lot. So nature is your genetics and nurture is your environment. And how do they interact and how do they create who you are, right? And so we are innately able to learn language. We were born with the ability in our brain and our mind to learn language. Yet how we learn how falling off a couch hurts or running and scraping our knee, those are all learned in our environment as we grow up, right? So there's always this give and take with that debate. So real quick, we're just going to go through a few people that are really important. Dorothea Dix was so important to our psychology world. She was the first advocate for those suffering with mental health, with mental illness. She was the one who really got people going and saying, this is not okay. So if you read The Cuckoo's Nest, the way they treated people who have mental health issues were awful. There was insane asylums during the American Civil War. People were put in cages. Because schizophrenia is genetic. And so means you're born with genetic abnormalities that will present itself in teenage years. They were almost screwed from the get-go because there was nowhere in society that would really understand them, accept them, and a lot of people ended up in jail or mental asylums, right? So now we're going to go into the first two structures of thought. Okay, so we have structuralism, and then we're going to talk about functionalism. Okay, so structuralism. So Wilhelm Wundt, that is how you pronounce his name, he is the father of psychology. He was the one who first established the first psychology lab in Leipzig, Germany. I actually had a foreign exchange student one year who was from Leipzig, so that was pretty cool to have her tell us about the town and all that. But his goal was to study the consciousness and how the elements of the mind are organized and related to each other. Okay, so structuralism was the first kind of attempt of figuring out what psychology was, and William Wundt is the one who created it. And on the other hand, and he's the one who used introspection. So let me get out of the little camera's way. And introspection is a way of just kind of asking people, how does this, so there's a reason that introspection didn't work. It was kind of like, how does this flower make you feel, or how does this house make you feel? And it's kind of like a way to try to pull from your unconscious. And soon we realized there was too many biases in this aspect, right? So structuralism was cut. Next, we had, right there, looking inward, considering our own decisions and thinking. But next, after structuralism, we had functionalism. And this was William James's idea, and he came after William Wundt. And what he thought was, William it was too narrow and too boring, his idea of what structuralism was. So William James was influenced by Darwin, and he was interested in understanding how the consciousness, consciousness, like feelings, thoughts, and feelings, and how it helped people adapt to their environment. And so he used introspection, but he also used questionnaires and mental tests. So they were still trying to attempt, like, how do we measure and study the mind and the body? And structuralism and functionalism were the first attempts. All right. And then we have Gestalt psychology. So after structuralism and functionalism, Gestalt came about. And he didn't like William Wundt's ideas either. And what he believed was we're kind of like a bigger part of a whole. And he believed that the consciousness was best understood by observing the whole experience. Rather than trying to break down clusters, he wanted to see the whole picture of someone's life. So he's like, well, what about the biological? What about the social? What about the cultural? He felt like we didn't have enough, right? And so Gestalt's catchphrase is, the whole is greater and different than the sum of its parts. So essentially, let's look at the whole picture of Sally and her eating disorder instead of just looking at the cognitive view or the behavioral view, right? So Gestalt, a little hint to write about Gestalt, it's the whole, okay? So it means to look at the whole picture. Alrighty, so now what we're going to do is kind of dive into each of the lenses that we talked about. And so we're going to start again with psychoanalysis, okay? So again, here's Freud. This is the magnificent Freud, and you will learn that we will have many jokes about Freud, but he is the one who created psychoanalysis. And remember, that's one of our lenses, and psycho actually means mind, and it's a Latin root for mind, and analysis, so analyzing the mind. So Sigmund Freud, he first focused on abnormal behavior. So he believed that all behavior and mental processes are directed by, again, unconscious forces. So I will underline that real quick, unconscious forces. Let me get out there, okay? And problems that rise up are from conflict of your mind, right? So he used free association and dream analysis to explore the unconscious. So you would come into his office, you would lay down on a couch, and you would explain your dreams, and Freud would start to nitpick what you were talking about. Were you avoiding talking about your mother? Were you avoiding talking about your family? And he starts to pull the unconscious conflicts or desires that come from your mind. And this is still very controversial, as you can tell, yet he had a big influence on the field of psychology due to him figuring out the unconscious. And if you've ever heard of the id, ego, and superego and any other classes, he also created those, or he founded them, right? So we will learn more about Freud later. So remember, Freud, psychoanalysis. So anything that starts with psycho, which is kind of ironic, but within the mind, Freud was the master of it, okay? All right, so again, free association, saying whatever comes to mind without censorship, right? And now we're just diving into behavioralism. And our biggest guys in behavioralism are J.B. Watson and B.F. Skinner. And so they will be talked about in the learning section of our book. So behavioralism was very popular in the 1920s and 60s because it was something that you could see. right? So again, behavioralists, they want to be able to see what they're looking at and what they're observing. They disagreed with practically everyone else in the field. So something funny about these psych lenses is that, like, so cognitive psychologists hate behavioralists because behavioralists don't think about the mind when they make these decisions, and vice versa. They believe that psychology should only study what can be observed. Okay. Oh, I still kept my line in here. Let me erase that real quick. So again, a big buzzword: observed. They were interested the most in what could be observed. Okay. And then we also have the fact that, so Skinner, when we learn more about Skinner, he was so focused on what shapes our behavior, right? So if you've ever trained a pet or a dog, what trains their behavior to sit or to run to you, or, and like, how do all these work and how do they motivate us, right? So again, so behaviorists don't think of your cognitive aspect, they only look at your behaviors. So if Sally had an eating disorder, a behavioralist would only look at the behavior she's thinking of, or what she's doing, maybe avoiding food or whatever, but they're not thinking about what's going on in the cognitive, what's going on in the mind. Okay? All right. Let me erase this little. Whoop. All right. So now we're kind of getting into more contemporary psychology. So now these newer lenses have come to light since, okay? So again, like I said, we define psychology today as study of behavior with our mental processes. And there is a controversy still, which I already mentioned, about what is nature and what is nurture. So let me get rid of my little camera. So human traits versus our experience. So nature is genetics and nurture is our environment, and that is going to be the study of our whole entire class, right? So every chapter, it's like, what is influenced by genetics and what is influenced by our environment? And there is no clear winner, my people. Fun fact. So genetics versus environment, okay? So this biopsychosocial approach has a little bit of everything, right? And this is a very new approach to kind of contemporary psychology, where psychological influences are also connected to your biological, your genetics, and your social cultural. So we're taking into effect your mind, your behavior, and the social environment that you're in and your cultural environment, because those all play a part to who you become and who you are and how you make decisions, right? So just like I said, genetic predispositions, your genetics, you're responding to environment. And then, like I said, psychological influences, learned fear and other learned experiences. So again, your mind is constantly remembering what hurts, what doesn't, what is safe, what is not, and it's forming who you are. And then, like I said, social cultural lens, presence of others, what peer groups you're in, who are your role models in the household and your peers, and that all plays a heavy part, okay? All right. So kind of thinking back into the bigger picture, I just kind of wanted to go over what we talked about. So let me move my little camera. Okay. So again, we have biological perspective, understanding the brain, and the questions that they ask through this study is like, how are these chemical messengers being transmitted? Is there a imbalance of hormones? Evolutionary, like we said about Darwin, it's all about kind of adaptation and development, and how does evolution influence our behavior and tendencies? When we put on our behavior genetics, which again, this is where do you have any abnormalities that are going to affect your genetics later on? So again, with if you fall on the spectrum, if you have any missing chromosomes, this is all going to come into behavioral genetics effects, right? And again, psychodynamic, when we talk about Freud, the way that you look at it is through what is their unconscious motivation? What is Sally, like what happened in Sally's childhood that may have manifested now later on to where we are? We have the behavioral perspective. How do we learn to fear particular objects? Remember, behavior is all about what we can see. And then we have our cognitive, which is all within our brain. How do we use information to remember, and how do we interpret the impact of our behavior? So how does A get to B, get to C, right? So in the cognitive, how does Sally think about eating a hamburger to not wanting to and thinking that it's going to bad things are going to happen. So how can we change these cognitive thought processes, okay? And then here's our more contemporary ones, like we just talked about at the end. Humanistic. How can I make myself a better person? So again, do they have all the needs that they have in Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which we'll go more into? And remember, all of these lenses we're going to be diving into in each chapter. So in order to understand our chapters, we have to understand the lenses that we're putting ourselves in with each chapter. And then again, social cultural, how does our various ethnic groups affect us? How are our social influences affecting us? Is it different cross cultures? What's acceptable in some cultures is not acceptable in others. And how does that affect us, right? And again, this is just a little bit more review. So again, it's a way for you to kind of put yourself in their mindset. So if you were this type of psychologist, a biological, you would analyze the connection between the mind. Again, these are ways for you to have a deeper understanding of what I already went over. Again, development, we study changes over a lifespan. Cognitive studies how we perceive, think, and solve problems. Personality, so these are all so you can be a personality psychologist, a cognitive one, a social psychologist, and these are just the different ways that they look at situations, okay? All right. And again, like I said, more review of like if you could put yourselves in their shoes. Industrial organization is actually a new domain. It's a brand new, I want to say Sonoma State just recently had IO psychology come in the last 10 years. So industrial psychology is like all about how to improve the workplace. So you go to businesses and you try to improve morale and behavior in the workplace, which is pretty cool. Again, clinical assessment of treatment of individuals with mental illness. These are all just different domains that we are going to be going over in the long run, okay? Educational, counseling, clinical, and positive. I would love to be an educational psychologist, but there's a lot of money to do that program. All right. We're getting near to the end. A little difference, and we're going to dive into the difference of what types of jobs you can have later on. But just the two main ones is there's the clinical psychologist and then a psychiatrist. I clearly just only have a minor in psychology, so I do not make the big bucks. Teaching psychology is actually one of the lower ended paid jobs. But if you get a PhD, you can study, assess, treat people with psychotherapy. And a psychiatrist, the main difference is psychiatrists are allowed to prescribe medicine. And that is where you have to go through med school. And it takes a lot of time, but psychiatrist is the most expensive you can do with psychology. And so they are able to prescribe. There is some clinical psychologists that in different programs can prescribe like lower medicines that aren't high up in like the antipsychotic scale. But yes, it is. So those are the two distinctions. And last but not least, this is our last slide, just a few people when it comes, so if you've ever heard of APA format, lucky for you guys, APA format is for people who want to major in psychology. It's just the way of writing papers. And so for English, we have MLA format. But essentially, it's just our way of how psychology is how you write papers. It was founded at Clark University. Mary Calkins is the first female president of the APA. Stanley Hall, first president of APA, first to earn a PhD in psych. And then we have Margaret Washburn, who's the first female to earn a PhD in psych. So I just wanted to kind of do a couple shout outs to the people of our APA organization. And that is the end of this module. Feel free to replay it and take your time with writing notes.